She stepped off that train wearing silk gloves and carrying a leather satchel full of poetry books. He was waiting on the platform holding a handwritten sign, boots caked with mud, jaw set like a man bracing for bad news. They had promised each other everything in their letters. They had lied about almost all of it. This is the story of two strangers who entered a marriage built entirely on deception, and somehow built something that outlasted them both. Stay until the very end, because nothing about this story goes the way you expect. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The platform at Billings Station smelled like coal smoke, wet leather, and the particular kind of anxiety that comes from making a decision you can't take back. Calder Ashcroft stood apart from the small crowd of people waiting for the afternoon train, which was already 12 minutes late. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget with his hat the way the young man beside him did, turning the brim over and over in nervous fingers. Calder simply stood with his arms at his sides and watched the eastern horizon for smoke. He was 34 years old and had not been this uncomfortable since the winter of 1879, when a bad decision about a river crossing had left him stranded for 4 days with one elk carcass and a broken boot. At least that time he'd only been risking himself. He pulled the last letter from his coat pocket and read it again, though he already knew it by heart. I am no stranger to hard work, Mr. Ashcroft. I have managed a household since my 16th year and consider myself capable in all domestic matters, cooking, preserving, mending, and the general care that a working homestead requires. I am not looking for comfort. I am looking for a life with purpose. The letter was signed, Evelyn Hawthorne, Boston, Massachusetts. He folded it back into his pocket. He had written back, of course. 3 letters in total, each one carefully worded to present his situation in the most reasonable light possible. He had described the ranch, the acreage, the cattle, the cabin, the mountain views. He had used the word prosperous twice and established once, which were perhaps the 2 most flexible words in the English language when applied to a place that had one functioning window and a roof that leaked over the stove. He had not lied exactly. He had simply chosen which truths to share. The train announced itself with a long whistle before it appeared around the bend, and Calder tucked the letter deeper into his pocket, as if hiding evidence. He spotted her immediately, which surprised him. He had expected to feel uncertain, to scan the platform, comparing faces to the small photograph she'd sent, that stiff, formal portrait where she looked about as warm as a courthouse step. He had prepared himself for confusion, but there was no confusion. There was only one woman on that platform who moved like she was trying very hard not to look alarmed, and she was wearing a gray traveling dress with blue trim that cost more than Calder's best horse. Evelyn Hawthorne was 26 years old, slender, and possessed of the particular kind of composure that comes from being raised in a house where showing distress was considered poor manners. She had dark brown hair pinned neatly under a hat that was going to be completely useless against Montana wind, and she was carrying a leather travel bag in one hand and a small stack of books tied together with a strap in the other. Behind her, a porter struggled with a trunk. One trunk. Calder had specifically written that she should bring practical clothing, tools, if she had them, seed stock, if possible. The trunk, when the porter finally set it down, made a sound like shifting paper. Books, Calder thought. She brought books. He crossed the platform. Miss Hawthorne. She turned, and for just a moment, one honest, unguarded moment, he watched her take him in the way a person does when they're mentally revising an expectation. Her eyes moved from his face to his coat to his boots and back again, quick and careful, and whatever she found was clearly not precisely what she'd pictured. Then her composure snapped back into place like a shutter closing. Mr. Ashcroft, she extended her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you in person. Her voice was steady. He'd give her that. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, which surprised him, and her palm was smooth, which didn't. You have everything? He asked. I believe so. He looked at the trunk. That all of it? Yes. He nodded once, picked up the trunk, lighter than expected, and started toward the wagon without saying anything else, because he genuinely could not think of a single thing to say that wouldn't make the next 10 minutes worse. The ride out of Billings took them north and then west, following a road that got progressively less road-like as the afternoon wore on. For the first 20 minutes, Evelyn sat straight-backed on the wagon seat beside him and watched the landscape with an expression of careful neutrality. The prairie stretched out in every direction. Brown grass, scattered rock, the occasional dark line of a creek cutting through the flatness. The mountains were still far to the west, blue and theoretical in the distance. "It's very open," she said finally. "It is. The letters mention mountains. They're there." He nodded toward the west. "Take about another hour to really see them." Silence settled back over them. Around the 30-minute mark, she asked, "Is it always this windy?" "No," he said. "Sometimes it's worse." He heard her exhale quietly through her nose, but she didn't say anything else. They were about halfway to the ranch when she reached into her travel bag and produced a small leather-bound book, which she opened in her lap and began reading. He glanced sideways at her. Reading in a moving wagon on a rutted road seemed optimistic, but she managed it with a steadiness that he found, despite himself, slightly impressive. "You read a lot?" he asked. "Yes." "You mentioned that in your letters." "You mentioned that the ranch was prosperous," she said, eyes still on the page. He stared at the road. "It is," he said. "Relative to what it was." She turned a page. "I'm sure." The cabin came into view just as the light was going golden and long across the grass. Calder had told himself during the drive out that he'd been too hard on himself. The place wasn't as bad as he remembered. He'd done work on the roof just last month. The fence posts along the south pasture were new. He'd even cleared some of the split wood off the porch, so it didn't look quite so... Evelyn said nothing. That was somehow worse than if she'd said something. She sat on the wagon seat and looked at the cabin, the weathered gray boards, the single window with its warped frame, the stovepipe that listed slightly to the left, the porch sagging at the far end where a support post had shifted, and she was absolutely, completely silent. "The inside is better than the outside suggests," he said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for him to help her. He watched her cross the yard, step up onto the porch, with the careful precision of a person testing ice, push open the door, and go inside. He sat on the wagon for a moment longer. Then he unhitched the horses. The inside was not better than the outside suggested. Evelyn stood in the middle of the single main room and made herself look at all of it. The rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, the iron stove streaked with rust, the shelf holding 3 tins and a lantern, the bedstead visible through the half-open door to the left, the bare board floor with its gaps wide enough to see the cold ground beneath. It was clean, she would say that for it, austere in the way that meant whoever lived here simply didn't own enough things to make a mess. She set her books down on the table. She sat in one of the chairs. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them, her smooth palms, her clean fingernails, the slight callus on her right index finger from years of holding a pen, and she thought, with the particular clarity that comes from having no other option, "You made this choice. Now you live in it." When Calder came inside 20 minutes later, she was at the stove, attempting to understand the damper. "You'll want to open that before you light it," he said from the doorway. "I gathered that," she said. "I'm trying to determine which direction opens it." He crossed the room, reached past her, and turned the handle a quarter turn clockwise. "There." She stepped back to give him room. He crouched in front of the firebox, laid the wood with the quick, practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and had a fire going in less than 2 minutes. "I'll start dinner," she said. "You cook?" "I said I could manage a household." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him directly for the first time since they'd arrived. "I'll manage." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and went back outside. She found beans in the small pantry off the kitchen wall, and flour, and a tin of coffee. There was a cast-iron pot hanging near the stove, a skillet, a wooden spoon. She had watched her family's cook, Mrs. Brennan, make 100 meals in her life. She had watched with the incurious half-attention of someone who assumed that knowledge would be available to her whenever she needed it, the way books are in a library, simply there, accessible on request. It turned out that watching was not the same as knowing. The biscuits went wrong somewhere between the mixing and the heat. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, only that she'd followed the logic of what she'd observed, and the result sat in the pan like small gray stones. The beans needed longer than she'd given them. The coffee she'd made too strong, then tried to correct by adding water, which produced something that tasted like neither coffee nor water but suggested both. She set everything on the table just as the light outside went fully dark. Calder came in, washed his hands, sat down, and looked at what was in front of him with an expression that revealed nothing. He took a biscuit, bit into it, chewed with the determined jaw movement of a man working through gravel. He set the biscuit down. He tried the beans. The spoon came up with beans that were still, quite distinctly, firm. He tried the coffee, said nothing. Evelyn sat across from him. She had tasted everything herself, so she had no illusions about what he was experiencing. The wind had picked up outside. It moved around the corners of the cabin in long, low notes. The fire in the stove popped and settled. "I owe you an honest accounting," she said. Calder looked up from the beans. "I am not experienced in frontier cooking," she said. "I have managed an urban household, which means I directed servants. I cannot bake bread. I don't know how to milk a cow. I've never made a fire in my life before tonight, and I made you light that one. I am proficient in exactly the things that are useless out here. Correspondence, French, piano, the literature of 3 centuries. She kept her voice flat and even. "You told me in your letters that you ran a prosperous, established ranch. I would not describe what I've seen today with either of those words." The fire popped. Calder turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The word prosperous is doing a lot of work," he said finally. "The word experienced was doing similar work in my letters." He almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth shifted, then went back. "So," he said. "So," she agreed. They sat with that for a moment. "I could go back," she said. "I have enough for a train ticket if you'd return what you paid for the fare out here. It wouldn't be the first unconventional arrangement that was quietly dissolved." "Could," he said. Or what?" He picked up the biscuit again, looked at it, set it back down. "Or you could learn. And I could learn whatever it is you know that I don't." Evelyn looked at him. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the steadiness in his face, the complete absence of self-pity or blame. She'd expected anger. She had prepared herself for recrimination. She had not prepared herself for practical. "What would you need me to know?" she asked. "Everything," he said simply. "The same as anyone who lives here." "And what is it you think I know?" He was quiet for a moment. "You read. You think in a way that's different from how I think. The way you looked at the pantry tonight when you thought I wasn't watching, you were counting, organizing, seeing a system." She had been, though she hadn't known he'd noticed. "That might be useful," he said. "Come winter, if we're careful about what we have." The fire in the stove had steadied to a low, even burn. Outside, the wind moved across the Montana dark in long, cold waves. Evelyn looked at her hands again, then at the cold biscuits on the plate between them. "Teach me to make bread that doesn't break teeth," she said. "First thing tomorrow," he said. "And the cow." "She's patient." "I am not," Evelyn said, "but I will try to become so." He nodded. Something settled between them that wasn't warmth exactly, not yet, but was at least the beginning of something solid. The agreement of 2 people who had both arrived with wrong information and were choosing, instead of retreat, the considerably harder thing. Neither of them had any real idea what that choice was going to cost them. But the food was terrible, the wind was loud, the fire was warm, and they were both still sitting at the table. That, for now, was enough. The first lesson happened at 4:30 in the morning. Evelyn had not been awake at 4:30 in the morning since she was 17 and had stayed up all night finishing a novel she wasn't supposed to be reading. That time had been voluntary. This time, Calder knocked twice on the frame of the bedroom doorway. He'd given her the only bedroom and was sleeping on a cot near the stove, and said her name in a flat, matter-of-fact voice that suggested he'd been awake for a while already. Already, she said. Bread takes time, he said, and the cow needs doing before the bread. She dressed in the dark, fumbling with buttons she couldn't see, and came out into the main room where the stove was already going and a lantern burned on the table. Her eyes felt like they'd been filled with sand. Her back ached from the unfamiliar mattress. She stood in the middle of the room in her least ruined dress and looked at Calder, who was already in his coat and moving toward the door. You're going to want different clothes than that, he said, not unkindly, nodding at her dress. These are the most practical clothes I have. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not judgment exactly, more like a man calculating a problem he hadn't expected. We'll figure something out, he said. The barn was maybe 30 yards from the cabin, but the wind had come up overnight and those 30 yards felt like considerably more. Evelyn had her coat pulled tight and her chin down, and she still arrived at the barn door with her hair half undone and her eyes watering from the cold. The cow's name, she would learn, was Ruth. Ruth was a large, broad-backed, temperamentally indifferent creature who regarded Evelyn's arrival with the mild skepticism of someone who had seen a lot of mornings and found none of them particularly surprising. She stood in her stall and chewed at something in a slow, circular way, watching. You want to introduce yourself first, Calder said, before you just grab. Introduce myself. Let her know you're there. Put your hand on her side so she can feel you before you start. Evelyn stood next to Ruth and placed her palm flat against the cow's warm flank, the way Calder had demonstrated. Ruth's hide was coarse and warm and smelled like hay, an animal, and something earthy she couldn't name. She stood there feeling slightly ridiculous. Now talk to her, Calder said. You're serious. It helps. Evelyn looked at the cow. The cow looked back with large, dark, utterly unreadable eyes. Good morning, Ruth, Evelyn said, in the same voice she used when being introduced to people she was uncertain about at parties. Ruth chewed. Now crouch down, Calder said, and I'll show you the grip. What followed was 20 minutes of the most humbling physical experience of Evelyn Hawthorne's adult life. The motion looked simple. Calder demonstrated once, slow and deliberate, and the milk came in a clean, steady stream that rang against the bottom of the pail. When Evelyn tried, she produced nothing. She adjusted her grip and produced a thin, indignant squirt that went sideways and hit her in the knee. She tried again, slightly desperate. Ruth shifted her weight, which was substantial, and Evelyn had to grab the side of the stall to keep her balance. Don't fight her, Calder said. She outweighs you by about 700 pounds. I'm aware, Evelyn said through her teeth. It took her nearly 40 minutes to get what Calder got in 8. Her hands ached. Her back ached from crouching. There was milk on her coat sleeve from an incident she preferred not to think about, but at the end of it there was milk in the pail. Not much, not as much as there should have been, but real and warm and present. She carried it back to the cabin with both hands, walking carefully, as if it might disappear. She did not say she was proud of herself. She had been raised in a house where that kind of declaration was considered gauche. But something in her chest was doing something unfamiliar, and she decided to let it. The bread lesson was worse. Not worse in the way that the milking had been physically awkward, but worse in the way that it revealed something about her that she'd never had to confront directly. She was accustomed to being competent. She had been competent at everything she'd tried since childhood. Not always naturally, but with sufficient application she had always arrived at a reasonable result. She had assumed, without examining the assumption, that this would continue to be the case. The dough defeated her completely. The first batch was too wet. The second was too dry and crumbled when she tried to work it. The third looked right but came out of the oven flat and dense, and when she tapped it on the table it made a sound like tapping a book. Calder sat at the table eating a piece of it without comment, which was both generous and maddening. It's wrong, she said. It's bread, he said. It's a failure that has roughly the shape of bread. You eat it or you don't. Either way, it's not going to improve by being criticized. He took another bite. The problem is your hand. You're working it too hard because you're frustrated, and that makes it tough. You've got to stop when it stops being sticky. How do I know when that is? You'll know, he said. Takes a while to feel it. That is not an instructive answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. Some things aren't. She looked at the flat, dense loaf on the table between them. Then she pulled the remaining dough toward her and started again. She burned the fourth batch because she lost track of time while reorganizing the pantry, which was something she'd been meaning to do since the first night and had decided to address while the bread was in the oven. The reorganization was, objectively, an improvement. She'd found 2 tins of salt pork pushed behind a crock of cornmeal and a sack of dried apples that would go bad before winter if no one paid attention to it, and a worrying absence of any kind of preserving system that would tell you how old anything was. She made a list. She'd brought paper and a good pen, and for the first time since arriving, she was doing something she actually knew how to do. By the time she smelled the bread burning, she'd filled half a page. She pulled the blackened loaf out of the oven and set it on the table and stood looking at it. Calder came in from outside, saw the smoke, saw the loaf, said nothing. "I was making an inventory," she said. "Of what?" "Of everything in the pantry, the storage system. There isn't one, which means you have no reliable way of knowing what you have, what condition it's in, or how long before it needs to be used." She picked up the paper and held it toward him. "If we're to survive the winter, we need to know exactly what we have, what we'll need, and when things will run out. Otherwise, we'll reach March with nothing and no warning." He took the paper, looked at it. His finger moved down the list slowly, the way a person reads when they're actually reading rather than just looking. "The salt pork," he said. "Behind the cornmeal. 2 tins. I thought that was gone." He looked up. "I almost rode to Billings last week for more." "You would have wasted the trip." He handed the paper back. "You burned the bread." "I know. But the list is useful." "I know that too." He took his coat off and hung it on the peg by the door, and there was something slightly different in how he moved through the room after that. Some minor adjustment in how he occupied the space, as if the list had shifted some small internal calculation. He didn't say anything else about the bread. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had established a routine that began before light and didn't stop until after dark. She was up for the cow before Calder knocked. She failed at the bread in new and creative ways each morning, but failed slightly less catastrophically each time. She learned to read the stove's temperament. It ran hot on the left side and had a tendency to die if you left the damper at less than a third, and she stopped filling the cabin with smoke. Her hands changed first. The blisters came and broke and healed into something harder. She stopped noticing the cold of the metal pail handle in the mornings. She stopped noticing the weight of the water bucket. Her back took longer to stop hurting. Calder taught her to split wood on the 3rd day, which she'd expected to be impossible, and turned out to be merely very difficult. The technique wasn't about strength, he told her. It was about aim and letting the weight of the axe do the work rather than forcing it. She split her first clean piece on the 14th swing, and the 2 halves fell apart in a way that felt disproportionately satisfying. She didn't say so. She picked up the next piece and set it on the block. "You've got the angle now," Calder said from where he was leaning against the fence. "Don't coach me," she said. "I can tell when it's wrong." He raised his hands and said nothing, and she could tell without looking that he was not quite not smiling. What she hadn't expected, and what she would have found difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it, was how much the physical work changed the quality of her thinking. Back in Boston, her mind had been busy in a particular way, always processing, always reaching forward into consequence and implication, always a little ahead of wherever she actually was. It had made her efficient and occasionally exhausting to be around. Out here, there wasn't room for it. You were either paying attention to the thing in front of you or something went wrong. The cow needed your attention, the dough needed your hands, the fire needed your eyes. It was tiring in a way that sitting in a parlor reading was not, but it was also, underneath the exhaustion, unexpectedly quiet. She hadn't been quiet in a long time. She hadn't known she wanted to be. She didn't tell Calder this. She suspected he already knew. 3 weeks in, she made bread that was edible without apology. A real loaf, properly risen, with a crust that gave when you pressed it and an interior that was soft rather than dense. She cut 2 pieces and put them on the table at supper and didn't say anything. Calder picked his up, bit into it, chewed. He looked at the bread, then at her. "There it is," he said. That was all. But the way he said it, without performance, without condescension, with the simple recognition of someone who understood what the thing had cost, hit her somewhere she hadn't been expecting. She ate her bread and said nothing and was grateful they were both people who didn't make a fuss. The evenings were different from the days. The days were work, always work, layered and unfinishing. There was always something broken that needed fixing, always something that needed preserving before it went bad, always some skill she was in the middle of acquiring and not yet competent at. The days didn't give you much space to think about anything except what was directly in front of you. But after supper, when the fire was banked and the lantern was lit and the wind had settled into its nighttime routine against the cabin walls, there was a particular stillness that seemed to belong to both of them differently. Calder would sit with a piece of worn leather tack and work it slowly with an awl and a length of thread, repairing things by feel in the low light. He didn't read. He told her once, without embarrassment, that he read slowly and found it laborious. He'd had 2 winters of formal schooling as a boy and had taught himself the rest, and written words still required more effort from him than spoken ones. Evelyn read. She had brought 6 books, a fact she was now privately grateful for despite the uselessness of everything else in her trunk. And in the evenings she read them slowly, rationing pages the way she was now rationing the dried apples, because she had no way to get more until spring. One night in the middle of October, she was reading a poem she'd returned to several times, a long meditative thing about a man watching winter come across an open landscape, and something in it made her read it aloud without quite deciding to. Her voice came out low, and she stopped after 4 lines, suddenly self-conscious. Calder had stopped working. He was looking at the fire with the tack still in his hands, and his expression was the expression of someone listening to something they hadn't expected to want to hear. "Keep going," he said, not looking at her. So she did. She read the whole poem. It took maybe 8 minutes, and the cabin was very quiet except for her voice and the fire and the wind outside. When she finished, she closed the book over her thumb and waited. "Say that last part again," Calder said. She found it and read it again. The last 6 lines, about the way a man who has worked a piece of land long enough stops being a separate thing from it, how the land gets into him in a way that has nothing to do with ownership. Calder sat with that for a long moment. He turned the tack over in his hands. "That's right," he said finally. "That's exactly right." He said it quietly, like a man confirming something he'd known but never had the words for. Evelyn looked at him. The fire-lit side of his face, the set of his jaw, the way his hands had gone still on the leather. And she thought, he's been alone with this land for years, and no one has ever said that to him before. She opened the book to where she'd been and went on reading. They didn't talk about it afterward. They didn't need to. But the next evening she read again without being asked, and he put down the tack work sooner. And the evening after that he asked her, unprompted, what a particular word meant, immutable, which had appeared in something she'd read aloud the night before. She told him. He turned it over like he was testing its weight. Unchangeable, he said. Yes. Things that can't be different no matter what you do to them. Essentially, he was quiet for a moment. There's a lot of that out here, he said. I'm beginning to understand that, she said. The month turned and the cold sharpened. Frost appeared on the inside of the window some mornings, which was something Evelyn had read about but never experienced, and the first time she saw it she stood in front of it for a moment longer than was practical, watching the fern patterns of ice on the glass before she turned back to the stove. She had asked Calder in the second week how cold it got in January. He had told her. She had gone very quiet and then gone to her inventory list and started adding to it. Now she understood what the winter meant in a way she hadn't when she'd arrived. Not abstractly, not as a word, but as a concrete physical fact with specific consequences. If the woodpile wasn't sufficient, they would be cold. If the food stores weren't sufficient, they would be hungry. If the cattle weren't properly sheltered, they would lose animals, and with them any financial margin between survival and catastrophe. These weren't inconveniences. They were the actual shape of the danger. She started waking up at night sometimes with a particular kind of alertness, running numbers in her head. How many pounds of salt pork? How many days until the first hard freeze? How much corn was left? And how far it would go? The anxiety wasn't the kind she'd had in Boston, which had been mostly social and theoretical. This was the anxiety of arithmetic, of real quantities in a real situation where the margin for error was very thin. She told Calder about it one morning while they were working on insulating the cabin walls. She'd proposed packing dried grass into the gaps between the outer and inner boards, a solution she'd read about in a book on frontier settlement that she'd found at the bottom of her trunk beneath everything else. "You have a book about frontier settlement," Calder said. "I may have done some reading before I came," she said. "The book about household management and the frontier settlement book. What else is in that trunk?" "A history of the Roman Empire," she said. "A collection of essays on natural philosophy, 2 volumes of poetry, and 1 novel." He was quiet for a moment, packing the dried grass she handed him into the gap along the north wall. "You knew," he said. It wasn't an accusation. "Before you came, you knew you didn't have the practical skills." "I knew I was deficient," she said carefully. "I thought I could compensate with preparation. Books about something aren't the same as knowing the thing. I'm aware of that now. But the insulation idea," he said, "is from the book. And it's a good idea." He pressed the grass in tight and moved along the wall. "So the books aren't entirely useless." "That is high praise," she said. He almost smiled again, the same almost smile she'd seen before, that lived just at the edge of his face without quite landing. She was beginning to catalog its various appearances. When it meant he was amused, when it meant he was thinking about something she'd said, when it meant he was choosing not to respond to something that had annoyed him. There were more of the first kind than she'd expected. The north wall took them the better part of a morning, and when they stepped back and looked at it, patched and sealed against the winter that was coming, Evelyn felt something that was quietly related to pride, but wasn't that exactly. It was more like the satisfaction of a problem addressed. A real problem, with a real solution, in a place where the consequences were real. She was getting accustomed to consequences being real. She was getting accustomed to a great many things she hadn't expected. The cold she no longer fought. The early mornings she no longer resented. The work that had seemed endless in the first days had arranged itself into rhythms she now moved through with something approaching ease. Ruth had begun to tolerate her, which felt like a minor triumph. The bread came out right more often than not. She had blistered hands and aching arms, and she slept every night like a stone dropped in deep water. She did not write to her family in Boston. She had written 1 letter in the first week, carefully neutral in tone, describing the landscape and the weather, and nothing about the actual state of her situation. Her mother had written back with a note that managed to express both relief that Evelyn was alive and a delicate suggestion that if this arrangement proved untenable, her childhood room was available. She had not answered that letter yet. She didn't know what she would say. She knew that untenable was not the word she would use. Difficult? Yes. Uncertain? Absolutely. Full of failures she hadn't anticipated and corrections she was still in the middle of making. But there was something here, something in the work and the silence and the evenings by the fire and the cow that was slowly accepting her presence, that she hadn't found in 8 years of Boston drawing rooms. She couldn't name it yet, but she was not, she had decided, going back to find out if the name was available somewhere easier. November came in like something with a grudge. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single afternoon, the sky went the color of old iron, and by evening the wind was moving across the valley in long, unbroken waves that found every gap Evelyn and Calder hadn't yet managed to seal. She lay awake that first cold night listening to the cabin flex and settle under the pressure of it, and she ran her inventory figures again in the dark. The salt pork, the cornmeal, the dried apples, the woodpile, and told herself the numbers were sufficient. She almost believed it. What she hadn't been prepared for, despite everything she'd read, was the psychological weight of a Montana winter. Not the cold itself, not the work it created, but the particular quality of being enclosed. The sky coming down low and gray and staying there for days at a time. The horizon disappearing into weather, the sense of the world contracting to the size of the cabin and the barn and the 30 yards of frozen ground between them. Back in Boston, winter had been a season you moved through. Here it was a condition you lived inside. Calder seemed to register none of this. He moved through the shortened days with the same steadiness he brought to everything, unhurried, untroubled by the sky or the cold or the isolation. She watched him sometimes and tried to decide if it was genuine equanimity or the kind of numbness that comes from long enough exposure to hard conditions. She still couldn't tell. "Does the winter bother you?" she asked him one evening, a week into November, while she was reading and he was working on a section of harness that had cracked in the cold. "Bother me how?" he said without looking up. "The dark. The confinement. The—" She searched for the right word. "The sameness." He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. He didn't give reflexive answers. "There's a lot to do," he said. "I don't notice the sameness much when there's a lot to do. But when the work is done." "Then I sleep," he said. "Sleep comes easy when you've worked." She looked at the page she wasn't reading. "It's different for me." "I know," he said. She glanced up. "You know?" "I hear you," he said simply. "At night, you move around." She hadn't realized. "I'm sorry." "I'm not complaining." He drew the awl through the leather in a slow, deliberate pull. "Your mind doesn't stop the same way mine does. That's not a bad thing. It's just a different thing." She considered that. It was more observation than she'd expected from him, and more accurate than was entirely comfortable. "The book helps," she said. "I know that too." She turned back to the page. After a moment, she began to read aloud, not making a production of it, just picking up where she'd left off 2 nights ago. A long narrative poem about a man trapping in the far north, the way solitude changed his perception of time. Calder set the harness down and folded his hands and listened, and the fire did what the fire did, and outside the wind pushed against the walls with steady, impersonal force. It had become their arrangement without either of them formally declaring it. The evenings belonged to this, the quiet work, and the reading, and the occasional conversation that grew out of something she'd read, some word or image that required discussion. She had started explaining things to him, not because he couldn't understand them, but because explaining them made them clearer to her, and he asked questions that sometimes stopped her entirely because they cut directly to the thing she'd been circling around without seeing. "What does it mean when someone says a place gets into you?" he'd asked one evening. "The poem said it, but how does that actually work?" "I think it means the place changes how you see other things," she'd said slowly. "You start measuring everything against it. You carry it with you." He'd nodded once. "That's true," he said. "I went to Billings once for almost a month. Felt wrong the whole time, like wearing a coat that belonged to someone else." She'd written that down later, privately, on the back of her inventory list. She didn't know why. It just seemed like the kind of sentence that deserved to be kept. The first real crisis came on a Thursday in the second week of November, which she knew was a Thursday only because she'd been marking the days on the back of a page in one of her books. She'd gone out to the barn in the early dark to start with Ruth and found the water trough in the cow pen frozen solid. Not a surface skim she could break with the heel of her boot, but solid to the bottom. A dense block of ice that the cattle had been nudging with their noses. The cattle had gone without water since the previous evening. She went back to the cabin and told Calder, who was at the table with his coffee. He set the cup down and was outside before she finished the sentence. The solution was to haul water from the creek, which hadn't frozen yet at its center, and heat it at the stove in shifts. It took 4 hours. By the end of it, Evelyn's arms were shaking from carrying buckets, and her coat was wet to the elbows from a moment of bad judgment near the creek bank, and she was so cold she couldn't feel her left hand properly. But the cattle had water. She sat at the table afterward with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and said, "We need a better system." "Every winter I've had this problem," Calder said. He was drying his own hands by the stove, and there was a cut across 2 of his knuckles from something that had happened with the ice, which he had not mentioned. "Your hand," she said. He glanced at it. "It's fine." "It's bleeding." "Cuts bleed," he said. "The trough." She took a breath. "The trough needs insulation, hay packed around the exterior, and we should be breaking any ice formation before it freezes through, twice a day when it's this cold morning and last thing at night." He looked at her. "That's the right answer." "I know. I read about it in the settlement book." "Of course you did." She almost smiled. "We could also redirect the drainage from the barn roof to run closer to the trough. It's not much, but moving water resists freezing longer than still water." He was quiet for a moment, working through it. "That's a bigger job. Need to do it when the ground's not this hard. Spring then, but we add it to the list. She already had the paper out. She wrote it down. He watched her write and didn't say anything, but when she set the pen down, he reached over and turned the paper to read it and went through the whole list slowly, the way he always did, and she'd learned by now that this was how he showed he took it seriously. The slow, careful reading, the occasional slight nod. You should get that cut cleaned, she said. He turned the paper back. Later. Now, she said, infection is a real problem in winter. He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, the one where he was deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing or whether compliance was simply more efficient. He extended his hand across the table. She cleaned the cuts with the small bottle of carbolic she'd packed in the bottom of her travel bag, one of 3 genuinely practical things in her trunk, along with the Frontier Settlement book and a folding knife she'd bought in a Boston hardware store the week before she left, feeling both practical and slightly absurd. She'd thought the knife was the useful one. It had turned out to be the carbolic. He sat still while she worked. His hands were large and considerably more scarred than hers, with thick calluses across the palm base and fingers that had clearly been broken at least once. The index finger of his right hand had a slight angle to it that wasn't quite right. She didn't ask about it. You packed carbolic, he said. I packed carbolic, a good pen, and the settlement book, she said. Everything else in that trunk was essentially useless out here. The poetry isn't useless. She wrapped the cut with a strip of clean cloth and tied it off. That's the most generous thing you've said to me, she said. Don't tell anyone, he said. I have a reputation. She looked up. He was absolutely expressionless, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in the first weeks. A slight, contained warmth, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She released his hand and went to put the carbolic away. 2 weeks later, a neighbor arrived. His name was Walt Greer, and he ran a claim about 6 miles to the east, and he came riding in on a gray horse in the mid-afternoon with the specific purposeful bearing of someone delivering information rather than making a social call. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and weathered, and he shook Calder's hand on the porch with the economy of men who don't see each other often, but know each other well. He looked at Evelyn with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. This is my wife, Calder said, which was the first time he had used that word aloud to a third party in Evelyn's presence, and she noticed that he said it without any detectable awkwardness. Evelyn Hawthorne from Boston, who had been married on paper since September and had not yet fully internalized the fact. Ma'am, Walt said, with a nod that was respectful and slightly surprised, the surprise of a man who had expected something different, though whether different meant more or less than what he found she couldn't tell. Come in, Evelyn said. There's coffee. She put the coffee on and stayed near the stove while Calder and Walt talked at the table, which was partly politeness and partly the practical reality that the cabin was small and the tables seated 2 comfortably and 3 not at all. She listened without appearing to. Walt had come with news about the winter forecast. There was a man in town, apparently, who had a particular record for reading the signs, and his reading this year was bad. Not ordinary bad. The kind of bad that happened once every decade or so. A hard winter, Walt said. The hardest in a long time. How's your woodpile? Walt asked. Getting there, Calder said, which Evelyn recognized as the optimistic version. She turned from the stove. We need more, she said. Both men looked at her. The inventory I've been keeping, the current woodpile will last until approximately mid-February at normal burn rate. If the winter is as severe as you're describing, burn rate won't be normal. We'll need significantly more. Walt looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, then back at Calder. Smart woman, he said. She keeps track of things, Calder said. You need wood. I've got timber I've been meaning to clear on the East Ridge. You come help me fell it, I'll split you enough to see you through. Calder nodded. When? Saturday. Bring the big saw. After Walt left, Calder stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the gray sky, and Evelyn stood in the doorway. The temperature had dropped again while Walt was there. She could feel the difference against her face. He's right about the woodpile, she said. I know. I wasn't trying to make a point. I know that too. He turned and looked at her. You're right. We're short. He said it the same way he said most true things, without resistance, without deflection. She'd come to appreciate this about him more than almost anything else. He didn't argue with facts. "I'll start banking the base of the cabin with snow when it comes," she said. "It'll insulate the floor. The book has a method for everything," he said, and this time the almost smile actually landed. A real one, brief, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but real. "Don't sound so surprised," she said. "Knowledge is just stored experience." "Whose experience?" "Everyone who came before us and wrote it down." He considered this. "Useful, then. The people who came before." "Most of them." He went to get the big saw from the shed, and she went back inside to update the inventory list. Saturday came clear and brutal cold, and Calder rode out to Waltzland before dawn. Evelyn spent the day on the list of repairs she'd been postponing. The gap between the window frame and the wall on the north side that she'd stuffed with cloth as a temporary measure, the loose board on the porch that caught your boot heel if you weren't watching, the hinge on the barn door that had started sticking in the cold. She had not expected to become a person who repaired hinges, but she had become a person who repaired hinges, with a matter-of-factness that would have been incomprehensible to her 8 weeks ago. She was on the porch with the loose board when the Greer family's youngest, a girl of about 12 named Clara, appeared on horseback at the edge of the yard. She was apparently in the habit of riding around the valley on her own, in a way that suggested both a great deal of freedom and a family comfortable enough with her competence to allow it. She pulled up at the fence and looked at Evelyn on the porch. "You're the one from Boston," Clara said, not rudely, just directly. "I am," Evelyn said. "Papa says you keep inventory." "I do." Clara looked at the board and the hammer in Evelyn's hand. "Can you teach me?" Evelyn looked at the girl. The direct gaze, the complete absence of self-consciousness, the curiosity that hadn't learned yet to disguise itself as disinterest. "The inventory or the carpentry?" "Both," Clara said. Evelyn set down the hammer. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." "Well, I'll put water on. You're 12. "I drink coffee," Clara said. "Papa lets me." "I'll put coffee on," Evelyn said. Clara tied her horse to the fence post with the neat practiced efficiency of a child raised in the saddle, and came up the porch steps and into the cabin, and looked at everything with the interested, categorizing eyes of someone who understood immediately that this cabin was different from the one she'd been told about, that something had changed in it, some quality of organization and intention that hadn't been there when it was just Calder Ashcroft living alone. She looked at the shelf, where Evelyn's books stood, between a carefully arranged row of supply tins, each labeled in Evelyn's clear handwriting. She looked at the map Evelyn had drawn of the ranch, pinned to the wall beside the door, with notes on it in 2 colors of ink. She looked at the curtain Evelyn had made from a piece of fabric at the bottom of her trunk. A small and perhaps impractical gesture, but it kept the draft off the window, and the blue color of it changed the quality of the light in the room in the mornings. "It's nice," Clara said. Before it was just, she made a gesture that encompassed the concept of nothing in particular. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I know," and explained the logic of it. Clara understood immediately. She asked sharp, useful questions, and her handwriting, when Evelyn had her copy a sample entry, was better than expected. She had the mind of someone who liked systems, who found satisfaction in the idea that information could be organized in a way that made decisions easier. "You could do this for your family's ranch," Evelyn said. "Papa doesn't think I need to know ranch things," Clara said. "He thinks I should learn sewing and cooking." "And can you sew and cook? Mama taught me." Clara didn't say it with resentment, just fact. "But Papa's inventory is wrong. I can tell. He thinks he has more flour than he does." Evelyn looked at the girl. "How do you know?" "Because I help Mama in the kitchen, and I can see what we use, and it doesn't match what Papa says we have." "Does your mother know?" "Mama knows. Papa doesn't listen to Mama about numbers." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You should write it down," she said. "What you actually observe. Keep your own record. If you have the numbers, eventually even someone who doesn't want to listen has to." Clara looked at the ledger. "Can I take this page? To show Papa?" "Keep the copy you made," Evelyn said. That one's yours." The girl left an hour before Calder returned, riding out across the frozen ground with the copied page folded in her coat pocket. Evelyn watched her go from the porch and then stood there for a moment longer in the cold, because the afternoon light was doing something extraordinary across the valley. A low winter sun hitting the frost on the grass so that the whole field appeared to be made of something finer than grass. And she thought, "I have been here less than 3 months, and this place has already gotten into me." The thought arrived with the quiet certainty of something that has been true for a while without being stated. Calder came back at dusk with the wagon loaded with cut timber and Walt Greer's handshake still apparently warm in the set of his shoulders, the particular looseness of a man who has spent a day in comfortable company. He unloaded without asking for help, which had been his habit in the beginning, but when Evelyn came out and picked up the other end of a long section without commentary, he adjusted his grip and they carried it together without discussion. They stacked the wood in silence, working in the cold with the comfortable efficiency of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. She knew now that he worked from right to left, that he set the largest pieces first and worked down to the small, that he was more precise about stacking than about almost anything else, because a badly stacked pile could shift and fall and injure someone. She knew these things about him without having ever been told them. She had simply paid attention long enough to see them. "Walt asked about you," Calder said when they were most of the way through the pile. "What did he ask?" "Whether you were settling in all right." He set a piece of wood on the top of the row. "I told him yes." "Is that what you told him?" "It's accurate," he said. She picked up the next piece. His daughter came by. He looked up. "Clara?" "She has a very good mind for systems. She's 12. "That's not an obstacle," Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment, stacking. "Walt won't like it. If you're teaching her inventory and organization." "Why not?" "He's got specific ideas about what girls are for." "Then Clara will have to work around those ideas," Evelyn said. "The same as most people with specific ideas about what women should do." He looked at her sidelong over the woodpile. There was something in his expression she was still learning to read, somewhere between careful and something warmer than careful. "I imagine that's true," he said. They finished the stacking as the last light went out of the sky and went inside, and the cabin was warm and the smell of the beef soup she'd left on the stove had settled into every corner of the room. She ladled it out and they sat down and ate, and the wind came back up outside and the fire held, and neither of them said much. But the silence had changed over the weeks. It had lost the quality of two strangers enduring proximity and become something else. Something that didn't require filling, that held its own shape, that meant the same thing to both of them without either of them having to say what that was. She wrote the last entry in the day's inventory after supper. Woodpiles sufficient. Clara Greer, 1 potential. She didn't know why she wrote that last part. It just seemed like information worth keeping. December came without ceremony. One morning, Evelyn woke to a silence so complete she thought for a moment she'd gone deaf. And then she understood. The wind had stopped, which was somehow more alarming than the wind, because in the weeks since November arrived, the wind had become the constant background of everything, and its absence now felt like the held breath before something worse. She got up and went to the window, and the world outside was white. Not the thin, apologetic snow of the first few flurries that had come and gone in November, but real snow, serious snow, the kind that had an opinion about itself. It had come in the night and buried the fence posts to their midpoint and was still coming, slow and vertical in the windless air, and it had the look of something that intended to stay. She dressed and started the stove without waking Calder, which she had learned to do without thinking about it. The exact angle of the damper for cold mornings, the size of the kindling that caught fastest, the way you had to coax it for the first few minutes before it decided to commit. She had learned this the way she'd learned everything out here. Badly at first, then adequately, then without noticing she was doing it at all. Calder was up by the time the coffee was on, which told her he'd heard the silence too. He came out of the back room already dressed, looked at the window, and stood there for a moment. "How much?" Evelyn said. 14, 16 inches by the look of it. He moved to the door. "More coming." "The cattle." I'll go now. He was already reaching for his coat. I'll come. He turned. Stay in. I can manage. Two people manage faster than one, she said. I know what needs doing. He looked at her for a moment. That assessing look she'd come to know, the one where he was running some internal calculation about what was necessary versus what was simply his habit of working alone. The calculation had been coming out differently lately. Dress warm, he said. The 30 yards to the barn in that snow was nothing like 30 yards. The drifts had come up against the barn's south side to a height that took some negotiation, and the cold without wind was still a serious cold, the kind that went into your face and stayed. Evelyn had modified her clothing situation significantly since September. She was wearing Calder's old canvas work pants, belted tight with a piece of rope, over 2 layers of wool, and she had traded her traveling coat for a sheepskin one that Walt Greer's wife, a compact and plainly practical woman named Margaret, had produced from somewhere and sent back with Calder after the timber day without a word of explanation. It was ugly and warm, and Evelyn had never been more grateful for an ugly thing in her life. The cattle were unsettled, which was to be expected, standing close and moving their heads in the particular restless way they had when something was wrong with the world outside. Ruth was the exception. Ruth was calm in the manner of a creature that had seen enough winters to know that anxiety was not useful, which Evelyn found, not for the first time, quietly instructive. They worked for 2 hours, breaking the ice that had reformed on the trough overnight despite the hay insulation, redistributing the feed, checking the small calves for cold injury, reinforcing the barn door's latch, which the drifting snow had begun to interfere with. Evelyn worked without being directed, and Calder worked without directing her, and they moved around each other in the way they'd been moving around each other for months now, with the unconscious spatial awareness of two people who had learned how much room the other person needed. When they went back to the cabin, her face was numb and her boots were wet through, and she stood at the stove for 10 minutes before she could fully feel her hands again. Calder poured coffee and set a cup near her without being asked. She wrapped both hands around it. The south-facing drift is going to block the barn door by tomorrow if it keeps up, she said. I'll dig it out this afternoon. We should dig a path now before it deepens and stake it so we can find it if the wind comes back and drifts it over again. He looked at her over his own coffee. You thought about this on the way in? I think about things while I'm doing other things, she said. It's a habit. Does it get loud in there? The question surprised her into an honest answer. Constantly, she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, or the beginning of one that stopped when it decided it was too early for that kind of thing. They dug the path after breakfast and staked it with the long poles Calder kept for exactly this purpose, evidence that she wasn't the first person to think of this problem, only the first to put it in words before it became urgent. She filed that observation away because she found it reassuring. The problems here were real, but they were old problems with accumulated solutions. You just had to know where to look or who to ask. What she hadn't been able to solve, and what was beginning to trouble her more than the cold or the work or the darkness of the short days, was the question of the far west pasture. Calder had 15 head of cattle grazing there when the snow came, in a section of land that was farther from the barn than she liked. She'd looked at it on the map she'd drawn. The map had become a genuine working document by now, amended and noted and folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. And the distance troubled her, not because the cattle couldn't manage snow, but because if the weather turned genuinely severe, getting to them and back was not a trivial proposition, and if something went wrong out there, the time factor could make it fatal. She raised it with Calder on the 3rd day of the snow, when the storm had paused and the sky had that thin, washed-out look that suggested it was deciding what to do next. The west pasture animals, she said. Can we bring them in closer? He was sharpening a saw blade at the table, slow strokes with a file, and he didn't stop. The closer pasture won't support 15 more head. Already got 12 head there. What about the Greer land? He looked up. Walt said there's a section along his east fence he's not using in winter, she said. If we ask to graze there temporarily, it's closer to the barn, maybe 4 miles instead of 8. I'm not asking Walt for grazing rights. Why not? Because I'm not, he said, with the particular flatness of a man indicating that a subject was closed. She looked at him for a moment. "That's a reason made entirely of pride," she said. The file stopped moving. "Walt would help," she said. "You know he would. He came out here to warn us about the winter. He gave us timber. His wife sent a coat. These are not the actions of a man who is going to make you feel diminished for asking a practical question." Calder set the file down on the table. He looked at the saw blade. He had the expression of a man who knew he was wrong and was deciding how much of that knowing to show. "If we lose animals in the West pasture in a hard week," she said, more quietly, "we lose breeding stock. That's not pride. It's the arithmetic." He was silent for a long moment. Outside, a crow called once from somewhere in the white landscape. "I'll ride to Walt's tomorrow," he said. She nodded and went back to the inventory list. Walt said yes without hesitation and seemed, if anything, pleased to be asked. He came over himself 2 days later to help move the West pasture cattle, and he brought Clara, who arrived with bright eyes and a piece of paper in her coat pocket that turned out to be her own version of a supply inventory for the Greer household, copied in her careful handwriting with several additions of her own devising. She pressed it into Evelyn's hands in the yard while the men worked the cattle and said, "I found what I said about the flour. Papa looked at it for a long time." "Did he say anything?" "He said he'd check." Clara paused. "That's the same as yes, for Papa." Evelyn looked at the paper. The girl had added a column for estimated usage rate, which Evelyn's original template didn't have. "This is better than mine," she said. Clara's expression did something complicated. The surprise of someone who has been told something true that they'd hoped was true but hadn't quite believed yet. "Come in when they're done," Evelyn said. "I want to show you something in the ledger." The cattle were moved by midday, and Walt stayed for the noon meal, which had become a point of genuine, quiet satisfaction for Evelyn. Not because she was performing domesticity, but because the meals she produced now were actually good. The bread had been right for 6 weeks running. The salt pork and bean soup she put on the table that afternoon was hot and well seasoned, and Walt ate 2 bowls of it and said so, with the uncomplicated gratitude of a man who means what he says. "Calder," Walt said, soaking the last of his bread in the bowl, "you've been holding out on the valley." Calder said nothing, but Evelyn caught the look that crossed his face. Not quite pride, but something in the neighborhood of it, something he wasn't entirely sure he knew how to wear. After Walt and Clara left, the afternoon light going long and orange across the snow, Calder stood in the yard watching the horses disappear down the track, and Evelyn stood on the porch with her coat on, and there was a particular quality to the silence between them that she'd learned to recognize over the weeks. The kind that had something in it, something that neither of them had gotten around to saying yet. "You were right about the pasture," he said, not turning around. "I know," she said. He did turn then and looked at her on the porch, and the late light was on his face in a way that showed the lines of it clearly, the weathering and the tiredness, and underneath those, something she'd been watching slowly become visible for weeks, the way a shape becomes clear as snow melts from it. "I don't ask people for things easily," he said. "I noticed." "It's not only pride," he said. "It's—" He stopped, started again. "It's that being dependent on someone means they can take what they've given." She was quiet for a moment, holding that. "Walt's not going to take it back," she said. "I know." "I'm not going to take it back either," she said. "What I've given, what I know. It's not alone." He stood in the yard looking at her, and she let him, because she'd learned that he needed time with things. He turned them over the way he turned problems over, slowly, from different angles, making sure of them. "I know that," he said finally. "I'm still learning it." She nodded. "So am I," she said, "learning to ask." He came back to the porch, and she moved aside to let him pass, and he went inside. And she stood for a moment longer in the cold, looking at the snow and the orange sky and the tracks Walt's horses had left going east toward the Greer land. And she thought about what Calder had said about dependence and what could be taken back. And she thought about Boston, the rooms she'd moved through with their furniture and their certainties and their very particular way of pretending that comfort was the same thing as safety. She went inside. The hard week Walt had warned about arrived in the 3rd week of December without any announcement. It simply arrived. the way serious things do, all at once and entirely committed. The temperature dropped to something the thermometer on the porch expressed in numbers that Evelyn read twice before she believed them. The wind came back, but different from before. Not the sustained pushing of November, but a violent, directional thing that hit the cabin in gusts that shook the walls and sent the stovepipe groaning. They lost 2 days almost entirely to survival. Keeping the fires going, keeping the paths dug out, keeping the cattle watered and fed, keeping themselves functional. Evelyn stopped counting the trips to the barn. She stopped noticing the cold in the way she'd noticed it in November, not because it was less severe, but because there wasn't room for noticing. There was only the next task, the next thing that had to happen, and then the one after that. On the second day of the hard week, the cabin's north wall began to leak heat despite the insulation they'd packed into it in October. Evelyn could feel it in the room, a particular cold that moved, that had direction, that came from the corner near the window. She spent an hour finding the gap, which had opened where the frame had contracted in the extreme cold, and another half-hour sealing it with strips of cloth and a paste she made from flour and water that she'd read about in the settlement book and had never expected to actually use. It held. "You're pleased with yourself," Calder said when she came away from the wall. "I am," she said without apology. "You should be," he said. She looked at him. He was at the table with the harness work he'd abandoned since the storm, and he looked tired, the tired that accumulated, not the tired that sleep-fixed, the kind that came from sustained hard conditions. She had been looking at his face long enough now to read it the way she read pages, tracking the things that moved across it and the things that didn't. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He looked up. "What did you ask?" "I asked if you're all right. That includes things like whether you're sleeping, whether your hands are manageable. The cut on your right hand looks like it's bothering you. And whether the particular kind of tired you have right now is the kind that benefits from talking about, or the kind that benefits from being left alone." He sat with this for a moment. "The second one," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to the stove. He worked on the harness in silence for a while, and she worked on the next page of the ledger, updating the burn rate estimate for the woodpile based on the last 3 days, and the fire did its job and the wind kept its distance from the sealed wall. After an hour, he said, "The hand is fine." "I know," she said. "I could see by how you were holding the awl." "Then why did you ask?" "Because asking is different from knowing," she said. "You taught me that. You said the cow needed to hear you before you started. It works on people too." He was quiet for a moment. She didn't look up. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Just that. She held his gaze for a moment. "You're welcome," she said, and looked back at the ledger. 2 days later, the hard week broke. Not all at once, but in the particular way Montana cold retreated, in stages. The temperature rising in small increments that you only believed because the thermometer said so before your body had caught up. The wind eased. The sky lightened to a pale, fragile blue. Calder went out to check the west pasture cattle, now wintering safely on Walt's east fence, all 15 of them intact, and came back with an expression Evelyn had not seen on him before. She waited. "All fine," he said. "Every one of them." She nodded. "If they'd stayed in the west pasture," he said. "Yes," she said. He hung up his coat and sat down at the table, and she put coffee in front of him and sat down across from him, and they both just sat there for a moment with that. The knowledge of what hadn't happened, the shape of the disaster that had been a conversation about pride and arithmetic instead of a loss they couldn't have recovered from. "I'd like to expand in spring," Calder said. "The south pasture, if the ground conditions allow. Add breeding capacity." Evelyn turned to a fresh page in the ledger. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He did. He talked about land and cattle and water access and the economics of it in a way he'd never talked to her before. Not because he'd been withholding it, she understood, but because this was the first time it had seemed like the kind of conversation you had with another person, rather than the kind you worked through alone. He talked, and she listened and asked questions and wrote things down and asked more questions. and the afternoon light moved across the cabin floor in its winter angle, and the fire held steady, and outside the snow lay quiet and vast and indifferent to all of it. At some point, she realized she was not taking notes for him. She was thinking alongside him, contributing to something rather than recording it, and the distinction felt significant in a way she couldn't have articulated precisely, but felt clearly. "You'd need water rights on the South Creek section," she said. "That should be confirmed before you break any ground. I know who holds the neighboring claim. He's been wanting to sell the East Quarter." "If the price is reasonable." "It won't be," Calder said. "He knows I want it." "Then we don't let him know how much," she said. Calder looked at her. "We," he said. She met his eyes. "Unless you'd prefer—" "No," he said. "We is right." She looked down at the page, wrote South Pasture Expansion, Spring, Water Rights, East Quarter Claim. Then she wrote we. And then she crossed that last word out, because she didn't need to write it down to remember it. Christmas came and went without the ceremony she'd grown up associating with it. No decorations, no gathering, no particular marking of the day. Calder acknowledged it with a slight shift in the morning's activities, sleeping an hour later than usual, and producing from somewhere a small bottle of whiskey that he'd apparently been saving, and he poured 2 measures and pushed one across the table to her. She picked it up. He picked up his. "To making it through," he said. "Through what exactly?" she asked. He thought about it. "The first part," he said. She drank. The whiskey was rough and warm, and she made a face at it, which made him make the almost smile, and then something happened to the almost smile. It continued past the point where it usually stopped. It actually arrived, and it was different from what she'd imagined in those early weeks when she'd been cataloging its near appearances. It changed his whole face. She looked away before she said anything she'd want to take back, and drank the rest of the whiskey, and outside the Montana winter sat on the land like it owned it, which it did, and would until it decided to let go. She thought about spring and what it might look like from here, and what the South Pasture expansion might require, and whether Clara Greer's usage rate column was something worth developing into a proper methodology, and whether her mother had written a 3rd letter yet, and what she would say when she finally answered. She thought about this word "we" that she'd written and crossed out but not erased. She thought about making it through the first part. She picked up her book. January was the month that tested everything they thought they'd already proven. The hard week in December had been a warning. January was the real thing. The temperature dropped to numbers that stopped being meaningful as numbers and became instead a physical fact you lived inside. Not cold the way cold was a word, but cold the way stone is hard, absolute, and without negotiation. The creek froze completely. The snowpack on the cabin roof became a structural concern. On the worst mornings, the air itself seemed to resist breathing, sharp and thin, and the 30 yards to the barn was a distance you had to commit to the way you'd commit to a difficult decision. On the 14th of January, 3 things happened in the same night that nearly undid all of it. Evelyn was reading by the stove, one of her 6 books, now in their 3rd reading, the pages gone soft and familiar, when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a quality of silence from outside that was different from ordinary silence. She'd learned over these months that the ranch communicated in the absence of things as much as in their presence. The cattle were quiet in a particular way when everything was fine. When that quality changed, the change had a texture. She set the book down. Calder was already awake. He came out of the back room with his boots half on, which told her he'd heard it too, whatever it was. "The barn," she said. "Yeah." They went out into a night that was the coldest she'd experienced yet. The thermometer on the porch, which she checked with the lantern Calder held, read something that made her stomach tighten, and crossed the yard to the barn where the noise became clear. Not an ordinary restlessness. Something specific, something that had a direction. Calder opened the barn door and went straight to the back stall, and Evelyn followed, and what she saw was Belle. Belle was the best of Calder's 3 breeding cows. She'd heard Walt say so explicitly, and Calder's behavior around her confirmed it. Belle was 4 years old, strong and broad, and the most likely of the 3 to produce a healthy calf in spring. She was also, Evelyn saw immediately, in labor. And something was wrong with it. The calf's position was bad. Calder was on his knees in the stall with his coat already off, and his voice was low and deliberate, the voice he used when he was managing a bad situation and not letting the situation manage him. "It's turned wrong," he said without looking up. "I need both hands. Tell me what to do." He did. He told her in specific, practical terms, without softening any of it, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. She was past the point of needing things softened. She needed to know what was actually true. What was true was that he needed light, sustained, steady light, positioned precisely so that he could see what he was doing with both hands occupied. And he needed it for however long this took, and the lantern needed to be held at a height and angle that didn't waver. Evelyn took the lantern. She positioned herself where he indicated, to his left, holding the lantern at the height he specified. And she stood there. This is where the story becomes difficult to render in ordinary language, because what happened over the next hour was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no convenient moments of crisis and resolution. There was only the sustained, punishing fact of standing in a barn in January, in temperatures that had no interest in human endurance, holding a lantern at exactly the right height, while Calder worked with both hands and spoke quietly to the cow, and sometimes said a word to Evelyn when he needed the angle adjusted. She lost feeling in her fingers first, not gradually. There was feeling, and then there was a different quality that was not quite pain and not quite absence. Something in between that she understood was the cold doing what cold does when you let it work long enough. She adjusted her grip on the lantern handle. She did not lower it. Her shoulder began to ache. The arm extended, held steady. The small, constant muscular effort of keeping something still when your body wanted to shift or rest. She did not shift. She did not rest. She thought at one point about the morning she'd arrived at Billings Station in her silk gloves and her Boston coat, carrying books, scanning the platform with her careful composure intact, preparing herself to manage whatever she found. She had thought then that management was what this required: the right systems, the right information, the right arrangement of available resources. She understood now what management actually meant out here. It meant this: standing in a frozen barn holding a lantern until the thing that needed to happen happened, or until you couldn't anymore, and making sure the second option came after the first. Calder said, "Almost." She held. The calf arrived into the world in the 54th minute, and the sound it made, the first uncertain breath of a new living thing in that cold barn, was the kind of sound that went somewhere in you below where words operate. Calder sat back on his heels. He was covered in the evidence of the work and breathing hard, and he stayed that way for a moment, just breathing, before he started on the immediate necessities, clearing the calf's airway, getting it to bell, beginning the process of getting both animals through the next critical hour. Evelyn lowered the lantern. Her arm dropped with a heaviness that surprised her. She hadn't realized how much the sustained effort had cost until she stopped making it. She looked at her hand on the lantern handle, her right hand, which had been gripping the metal for nearly an hour in that temperature, and she could not fully open it. Her fingers were locked in the grip position, and when she tried to straighten them, the sensation was somewhere between pain and something else, and she made a sound she hadn't intended to make. Calder turned immediately. He saw her hand. He crossed to her in 2 steps and took the lantern from her carefully, setting it on the stall rail, and then took her hand in both of his. "How long has it been like this?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "A while." His hands on hers were warm, the warmth of someone who had been working hard in cold conditions, the animal warmth of effort. He worked her fingers slowly, carefully, the way you work something that needs to move again but has forgotten how. "You should have said something," he said. "You needed the light where it was." "Evelyn, the calf is alive," she said. "Belle is alive. That's the arithmetic." He stopped working her fingers. He looked at her, directly, in the way he rarely did, without the lateral glance or the careful management of eye contact that was usually his habit. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did." Something moved through his face that she would think about later, in the days and weeks that followed. Not an expression she could name easily, not any of the ones she'd catalogued over the months. Something less managed than those, something that had gotten out from under the usual control. He held her hands between his until the feeling came back into her fingers, painful and welcome. And then he turned back to Belle and the calf because there was still work to do, and she picked up the lantern again and held it for another 20 minutes while he finished, and her arm ached the entire time. They didn't talk much on the walk back to the cabin. The cold was still absolute, and the night was still dark, and there was nothing either of them needed to say that couldn't wait for somewhere warmer. Inside, at the table with the stove rebuilt and coffee on, Evelyn looked at her right hand, still faintly stiff, the knuckles pale from the cold, and then she looked at Calder across the table. "I want to talk about the spring wedding," she said. He looked up. "We were married on paper in September," she said, "arranged by a minister in Billings and 2 witnesses we don't know. That's a legal document. I'm not sure it's a marriage." She kept her voice steady. "I'd like to do it again, properly, with people we know. If you're willing." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. "Because I want to choose it," she said, "not be assigned to it. I want to stand in front of Walt and Margaret and Clara and whoever else and say it while meaning it, having actually met you." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "And do you?" he said. "Mean it?" She looked at him. The tired face, the scarred hands, the man who had taught her to split wood and read the sky and ask for things she needed, and who had learned from her that words could carry weight the same as timber, that knowledge stored in books was still knowledge, that dependence and trust were different things, and it was possible to have the second without the fear that made the first terrible. "Yes," she said, "I do." He was quiet for another moment, then, "Spring, then." "Spring," she agreed. The spring wedding was held on the second Saturday of April, when the snow had retreated to the high ground and the valley floor was doing its annual improbable trick of turning green. It was not an elaborate occasion. Evelyn wore her best dress, which was the gray one with blue trim she'd arrived in, cleaned and mended and altered slightly through the winter because she'd lost weight in the physical labor of the first months and then rebuilt differently with the muscle of real work rather than the softness of a sedentary life. Calder wore his good shirt and a jacket Evelyn hadn't seen before, which fit him well enough that she suspected it had been made for a different version of himself, and he'd grown back into it over the winter. Walt and Margaret Greer were there, and Clara, who was wearing a dress she clearly considered an imposition, but endured with the patience of someone who understood that social forms had their uses. 2 other families from the valley had come, the Okafor family, who ran a claim 6 miles south, and a widow named Mrs. Hendricks, who had built her own homestead alone after her husband died 5 years prior, and who was held in a kind of quiet regard by everyone in the valley for reasons that weren't stated but were thoroughly understood. The man who performed the ceremony was a justice of the peace from town, who had ridden out for the occasion and seemed genuinely pleased to be doing something that felt, as he said, like a real marriage and not just a piece of paperwork. Evelyn noticed that he said this without knowing how precisely accurate it was. She stood next to Calder in the yard of the ranch that she had helped build into something different from what it had been. The cabin behind them, with its sealed walls and blue curtain in the window, the woodpile stacked with a precision that was partly Calder's habit and partly her influence, the barn with its insulated trough and its repaired hinge. And she said the words she'd said once before in Billings in September, to a man she had not yet met. They meant something different now. When it was done, Walt shook Calder's hand and then surprised everyone, including apparently himself, by shaking Evelyn's hand too. Formally, seriously, the handshake you gave an equal. "You 2 have had a winter," he said. "We have," Evelyn said. "It shows," he said, "in the good way." Margaret Greer, who was economical with words in a way that made every word count, said simply, "Good." And then she helped Evelyn set out the food she'd prepared. The bread that had been right for months, a preserved beef dish from a recipe Margaret herself had shared in December, dried apple cake from Evelyn's own calculation of the apple stores. And they ate in the yard in the April sun while the valley was green around them. Clara ate her food and then materialized at Evelyn's elbow with a new ledger book, which turned out to be a gift she had made herself. Proper pages, stitched together, with her own column headers already printed at the top of the first page, including the usage rate column she'd invented. "For the expansion," Clara said. Evelyn looked at the girl, now 13, a little taller than she'd been in November, the same direct eyes and the same mind that moved in systems. "You're going to be formidable," she said. Clara considered this. "That's what I'm planning," she said. Calder stood nearby, talking with Walt and Thomas Okafor about the South Pasture water rights question, which had been a going negotiation since February. Evelyn listened with half her attention and watched him with the other half, the way he moved in the conversation, the way he'd changed in it. He'd learned over the winter to say what he was thinking before it became a weight he was carrying alone. Not easily, not without effort, not without sometimes needing her to ask the right question first. But he'd learned it. She'd learned things too. Things that still surprised her when she caught herself doing them. Reading a cloud formation without thinking about it, assessing a supply problem in her sleep, picking up the wrong end of a fence post and knowing without measuring how much it weighed. The frontier, which had seemed like a set of skills when she arrived, had become a way of thinking, a particular relationship with cause and consequence, a respect for the gap between what you knew and what you needed to know, and the willingness to cross it. These were not the things she'd come here for. They were not the things advertised in a mail order arrangement between two people who needed each other on paper before they needed each other, in fact. They were what the winter had made anyway, out of two people who had told each other lies and then, stranded together in the cold, told each other the truth instead. The South Pasture expansion began that June. The water rights took longer. The neighboring claimant was, as Calder had predicted, difficult about the price, but Evelyn had spent 3 months preparing for that conversation, and when she sat down with the man at the table in the Billings land office, she had the numbers and the patience and the absence of visible need that made the difference. She was not the woman in silk gloves anymore. She was something the man across the table had not expected to find on the other side of that negotiation, and the surprise cost him. They got the water rights at a fair price. The South Pasture went in that summer, and the cattle count grew, and the following spring they added a second structure to the property. Not much, just a storage building with a proper floor, but it meant that the original cabin had room to breathe, and Evelyn reorganized it in a way that finally resolved the stove placement problem she'd been working around for a year. She wrote to her mother that spring. A real letter, the first honest one, not managed or neutralized, but actual. She described the ranch and the winter and the wedding and the South Pasture and Ruth, who was now 5 years old and had accepted Evelyn's presence with the full indifference of a creature that has made its peace with the situation. She described Calder in terms that were careful but not neutral. Careful because she was still, in some ways, a private person who had been raised not to make declarations, and not neutral because she was no longer the kind of person who confused discretion with honesty. Her mother wrote back a letter that was shorter than usual and said, among other things, "You sound different. I can't say whether I recognize you. I think perhaps that is not the problem I imagined it would be." Evelyn read it twice and then put it in the ledger, between 2 pages of supply figures for the coming winter. She didn't write back immediately. She let it sit for a week while she thought about what recognition meant, whether it required someone to remain the same, or whether it could accommodate the fact of change, the way the valley accommodated each winter's revision of itself and still remained, recognizably, the same valley. She decided her mother was asking the right question, even if she hadn't meant to. She wrote back and said, "The woman you raised is still in here. She reads every evening and keeps thorough records and has opinions about the proper way to structure an argument. She has also, this year, learned to read a winter sky, deliver a calf in the dark, and negotiate water rights with a man who did not think she belonged at the table. I think she has improved, on balance." Her mother's next letter said, "I expect you are right. I would like to see this ranch." She came the following summer, a trip Evelyn had not fully expected her to make, and she arrived at Billings Station wearing clothes considerably more practical than Evelyn's had been, which made Evelyn laugh in a way that surprised her mother and told her everything she needed to know about what the country had done to her daughter. The years that followed were not easy years because the country didn't deal in easy. There were bad winters and dry summers, and the kinds of losses that farming life produces with a regularity that teaches you either to hold things lightly or to break under the weight of holding them too hard. They lost cattle in a blizzard in the winter of 1889. They lost a full season's harvest to drought 2 years later. There were arguments, real ones, the kind that came from two people with strong views and different ways of thinking, who had chosen each other's company and therefore had to reckon with each other's minds. Some arguments ended with resolution. Some ended with a long silence that meant the same thing, eventually. But the ranch grew. The cattle count doubled, and then grew beyond that. The storage building became a proper barn, and the proper barn eventually became a compound of structures with purpose and method behind them, because that was how Evelyn's mind worked, and she had, over the years, made it how the ranch worked. Clara Greer came to work for them 2 years after the spring wedding, on a formal arrangement that her father had taken longer to accept than it deserved. She managed the books and the supply chain with a methodical intelligence that exceeded what Evelyn had taught her, and had clearly been going on in her own head for years, waiting for someone to tell her it was a legitimate occupation for a person like her. Other families in the valley started asking Evelyn questions about preservation, about supply management, about the water rights process, about how she'd handled this winter or that dry season. She answered all of them. She answered without making a performance of it, and without minimizing what she knew, which was a different posture from the one she'd arrived with and a different one from the one she'd learned to wear in Boston drawing rooms. Calder, who had spent most of his life assuming he would work this land alone because that was simply what the land required of a person, learned over those years that the land did not actually require solitude, that it had just been what he knew. He learned to talk about the ranch with her in the evenings the way she read to him, not as instruction or report, but as conversation between two people who were both inside the same thing. He learned that asking for help from Walt, or from the Okafors, or from the people the valley gradually produced was not the same as weakness. He never stopped needing to remind himself of this, but he stopped letting the reminder exhaust him. On an evening in the fall of their 10th year on the ranch, Calder came in from the south pasture and found Evelyn at the table with a new ledger. Not a supply inventory, but something else, pages of writing in her clear hand, organized differently from the usual records. "What is that?" he said. She glanced up. "I'm writing down what we know," she said, "about the water drainage, the winter management, the cattle rotation, the insulation methods, all of it. Clara thinks some families to the north are having problems we solved years ago, and I thought," she paused, "someone should write it down properly, so it doesn't have to be learned the hard way by everyone who comes after." He stood in the doorway looking at her. The lamp was on the table and the light caught the side of her face, and she was 41 years old and she looked like what she was. A woman who had put 10 hard years into this land and carried them well, in a way that didn't erase the years but incorporated them. "That's the settlement book," he said. She considered this. "I suppose it is. You're writing the settlement book." "Someone who knows what they're doing should write it," she said. "I'm the closest available option." He came and sat down across from her and looked at the pages. He didn't reach for them. He rarely touched her things without asking. But he looked at them the way he always looked at things she wrote, with the careful attention of a man who knew that words were not his first language, and took them seriously because of that. "Read me some of it," he said. She found a page. She read, about winter drainage, about the frozen trough solution, about the hay insulation and why it worked, about how to read the sky for the kind of cold that came with no wind and was worse for that. She read in the plain, clear voice she'd developed over years of reading aloud to him, the voice that didn't perform but simply said the thing. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment. "That's the good kind of useful," he said. "The best kind," she agreed. Outside, the fall dark was settling over the valley in its particular way, the last of the light holding longest on the western mountains before it gave up and let the stars have the sky. The ranch was quiet, and the way it was quiet when everything was right, when the cattle were settled and the stores were sound and the structures were holding against whatever the season intended to bring. They sat at the table together in the lamplight, and she wrote, and he was quiet beside her the way he knew how to be. The comfortable quiet of a man who had learned, slowly, that silence shared with the right person was not the same as silence alone. This was not the life either of them had described in their letters. It was not the prosperous ranch or the experienced frontier wife or any of the things they had offered each other out of fear and optimism and the basic human desire to be chosen. It was more difficult than those things, and more true, and it had cost them both something they hadn't known they were carrying: Calder, his isolation; Evelyn, her performance of competence. And in the giving up of those things, in the cold and the dark, and the accumulated dailiness of 10 Montana winters, they had built something that had their actual shapes in it, not what they'd claimed to be, what they'd become. That, in the end, turned out to be more than enough.